Hello, everyone, and welcome to the brandLingual debate series, where we take one marketing idea that people tend to argue about in fragments online and give it the space for a proper conversation. I am Baiba Matisone, and today we are debating a motion that tends to divide marketing rooms pretty quickly. Brand building is the primary driver of long-term growth, and performance marketing is supporting tactic. Before we get competitive about it, a small reset. This isn't meant to be a winner takes all show. The point of this format is understanding strong arguments and clear definitions, evidence where we can get it, and enough honesty to admit where each side starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable. And there's also a twist that matters. In round one, each debater will argue and assign side. Then, halfway through, they will switch completely. Each of them will argue the opposite position as seriously as they can. The goal is to build the most confident case on both sides of the motion. Our debaters today are our returning guest, Mats Georgson, who is very well known expert in the marketing and brand strategy field. And on the other side, we have brandLingual co-founder Christopher Owens. And for the purpose of this simulation, we have done a hazel flip, and horns up or horns down means that one participant or one debater will take one side or the other. And as we flipped the coin, and we saw that hazel flip turned out that Christopher will be the first, so the Christopher will be the one who will debate for the motion, and Matt will be the one who will debate against it. In round two, they will swap. A few ground rules before we begin, just so we are debating the same things. First, when we say brand building, we mean activity aimed at creating future demand, memory, salience, preference, and potential pricing power over time. Second, when we say performance marketing, we mean activity optimized for measurable action in the near term. Clicks, leads, signups, purchases, pipeline, and immediate conversion. Those definitions are not perfect. In the real world, the two bleed into each other constantly. That messiness is exactly why the conversation is worth having. The structure today is simple. We will start with opening statements, followed by short rebuttals, and then moderated discussion. After that, each debater will briefly reflect on what they heard. Then we switch sides and do it again. We will end with the final reflection and a synthesis of the whole argument as a verdict. One request to both of you, please argue strongest version of the case, not the meme version. And the internet already has enough marketing theology. Let's try to be useful. And Christopher, the floor is yours for 5 minutes to argue in favor of the motion.
Okay, here we go. First off, thank you so much, Mats, for participating in this. I could not think of a better sparring partner to go into the debate dojo with on this particular topic. And so let's start with this. Let's argue that the best case for the motion is really that long-lasting growth comes mainly from expanding future demand, and that is exactly what brand building is really designed to do, with all 4 Ps being worked in concert. If we start with the strongest empirical tradition, or sometimes the thing that we say metaphorically is the closest thing that we have to absolute physics, I would fall back onto the NBD-Dirichlet or the negative binomial distribution chart, or as Weimer Snyder's loves to say, the banana chart, as always reminding us in any given category just how many people are out of category for so long. And then on the rare occasion that someone comes into category, they buy once and then they're back out of category for however long the interpurchase period in fact is. And given the length of time that someone is out of category for so long, it only suggests that work that can work in a long-lasting, durable fashion is the only kind of work that can ever make a difference at scale. I think the best paper that has tried to close that understanding from theory to practice, we would fall back on Binet and Field's work with IPA of the long and short, which also repeatedly argues that the best long-run business outcomes come from balancing, yes, short-term activation as a supporting act, but with a larger share of brand investment. Now, their original conclusion showed that brand building was the 60 to the 40, but that was in favor of brand, thus suggesting that brand building is the primary and that short term is supporting. Now, we also know that number can change, but brand building is still the primary. Even if you look at 50-50, in the end, we're looking at something where short term is never the primary. It is always some form of supporting acts. So why would that be true? Long-lasting growth is mostly a buyer acquisition problem. Again, when you go back to the extrapolations from the NBD, you start to see that this is not about a loyalty optimization opportunity. If I had to look back at what would now probably be considered co-owned by Ehrenberg Bass Institute, that brands grow by really increasing penetration and being easy to mind, which they refer to as mental availability, but physical availability is super important. So again, it's a 4 Ps argument. But brand building really helps the first part by making the brand more likely to come to mind in buying situations so that on those occasions when someone comes into market, you have stacked the deck in the favor of that particular brand over time. It also supports the second by making distribution work harder on shelf or in feed. So whether that be SEO or whatever it might be. Performance marketing is really good at producing visible, fast feedback, and it gamifies these magical dashboards that we pour all of our money into. But speed is not the same thing as scale. And attribution is not the same thing as incrementality, which is what we need to prove in order to see that things are going to be sustainably profitable. The motion is that the primary driver claim really gets stronger when you simply look at what happens with brands that chase efficiency too hard. You could even look at Work's multiplier report, which has tried to modernize this understanding, particularly for a North American set of data, really argues that tighter targeting, yes, can raise ROI while reducing total profit because all those efficiency gains often come from addressing a far more narrower, smaller audience. And really, if you want more of the pie, don't chase after a smaller piece. So I don't know, maybe in plain lingo, you can make the dashboard a whole hell of a lot prettier. You can have amazing ROAS, but you can also be losing market share at the same time, which will just make the business smaller over time. So yeah, long-term, long-lasting growth needs reach. It needs spread, both in terms of creation of mental availabilities across all the category entry points, but making certain that your distribution and your product variations are also physically answering those calls at scale. And really, brand building across the entire 4 Ps is built for that. This is not a 1 P scenario at the heart of my argument. Now, I can imagine that the obvious rebuttal is that performance pays the bills, true, but that still makes it a supporting tactic in the long run growth model. Sales is still the supporting aspect of this whole thing. It is not the primary growth engine. So the engine is what really creates all of this future demand at scale. And then performance is more of catching them when they fall, or it's like the gearbox that might convert some of that demand. Again, really durable, enduring, long-lasting memory structures in order to try and just respect the boundary constraints that the NBD, in fact, classically shows us. And that brand building's home field is really born out of that. So yes, performance matters, but mostly as more of a harvesting mechanism supporting the hard work done over the long term. And I rest my case, my opening case.
Great opening statement. Love it.
Mats, you're opening against the motion. You have 5 minutes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As I think of this, I kind of feel how my soul sort of changes from the sort of the marketing Mats to the business person Mats, because I think that that is really the core of the argument here when I really sort of entertain the perspective of sort of say the primacy of performance. And it's, I think that the first one is it's all about the time frame. Business don't have time. If I'm running a company, I'm really trying to get my company to survive the next quarterly report. I'm trying to get it to survive the next annual result. to get it financed, to show progress. Anything that you tell me that will be good in 2 to 3 years is basically like the kind of decisions you don't want to take, and especially not on fairly weak justification that it works for most people, or look, here are some Brits that have like collected a lot of cases and it would probably be good for us. That's not what I'm going to put millions of dollars against. So I think that the first one is the sort of time frame that I think that people underestimate, that even if you're right, it doesn't mean that you can really tell me that I'm going to make like long-term investments that hopefully pay off, because when I go into that time frame, I have so much other things that I can also invest in across the entire company's life that can give me better chances of growth and survival. And the second one, which is quite related to that, is risk. My job as a business leader is to mitigate risk. Everything is risky. There can be downturns in the environment, there can be economical shifts, there can be shifts in demand. I have tons of things that I don't control. Don't give me another thing I can't control. When somebody talks about performance marketing, I see that there is an investment and there is a return, and I can sort of stay on top of that and I can make allocations as I see fit against it. These things that sort of go on mysterious multi-year cycles, even if they sound plausible, are much weaker in terms of mitigating risk. What if I'm building the demand against, so to say, tapping a demand that will not be there when I'm going to harvest it in 3 years? The longer the time frame, the more this explodes. And then I think that the third one is about the evidence. On one hand, I have the sort of like really heavy empirical evidence that when I put stuff in, I actually get cash back into the company. Kaboom. The other stuff, we have IPA, okay? And I like the IPA, but when you look at it, you got to sort of conclude a few things. First of all, the 60/40, as Chris says, is an average. They don't say that that is a rule, and it can be 40/60, which would actually then be an argument for the primacy in certain circumstances, primarily, for instance, when you are growing new businesses, etc. And also, it is another thing that is built in the sort of Binary Fields thing that I think actually speaks for the performance side, which is that they introduced the mysterious kind of like branded activation. And that sounds great to me. Yeah, sure, build brand, but I want both. Give me the cash back and build that darn brand for the future. Then I'm really happy. But don't use it as an excuse for me that I don't get results here and now if I'm going to build. But then if you can build for the future, I'm very happy, right? So I want to see that curve racing also in the long run, but not at the expense of actually delivering today. And I think it's quite interesting that even the IPA thing that everybody quotes so heavily on the branding side actually sort of tells this story indirectly. And I think that it's another thing also that I want to sort of raise, which is a bit of a shocker. I've heard this branding thing, of course, for a long time. I'm role playing now. And typically the branding people speak about Apple and Nike and Coca-Cola and all those classic cases. But if you look at the most valuated brands, the most highly valuated brands just 10 years ago, most of them are shrinking. That magic brand dust doesn't seem in itself to be any kind of guarantee of long-term financial performance. And when you look at the ones that really are growing and that have been doing great, Slack, Spotify, Google, YouTube, Netflix, they are not heavy on brand advertising. And so there are other mechanisms in place that, in conjunction with performance marketing, that harvests what the great stuff that you can build with a company today. That's the model. And the whole brand communications part may help, but I can't see the primacy of it from that perspective. So some of the most valuable companies that we've created the past 20 years are not heavy brand advertisers. And I do believe, however, that they are performance marketers in that they use it to basically as distribution, as physical awareness. You get your stuff out there so people can buy them. And that, I think, is another interesting mechanism here. People can buy things they don't quite remember if it's in front of them. But if it's not in front of them and they remember it, but they can't find it, you will not make the sale. So I think that that is yet another thing that shows that you need the performance marketing to actually be able to sell at all, especially when you sort of go very heavy on direct to consumer and you rely on that. That's your distribution. It must be then the primacy of that. And I think that the third that I would also say is that there is a bit of a replication crisis in science, and I do believe that also speaks a little bit for performance marketing aspects, because it is still the kind of like thing that brand can't offer. You actually see the cash in the bank within the same quarter and everything, right? The other stuff does build on science. It says it's progressing, but also all science, especially social sciences, also regress. They find out that what they said 10 years ago is not so correct anymore. And I do believe also that some of the fanciest things today that people will bring up, how brands grow, for instance, is actually not at all a growth thing. It just tells you how static things tend to become, and that it's really important to harvest physical availability is equally important as mental availability. And I would even claim, as I say, that physical availability can build mental availability, but not the other way around. So I'm not even sure how brands grow really sort of says about the primacy of brand versus performance in reality. So in the end, I do think that the branding story sounds good, but the performance story delivers, and it will always have the advantage from that point of view.
Thank you, Matt. Now we move to rebuttals. And Christopher, you have 2 to 3 minutes to respond to what you just heard.
Well stated, Mats. I feel that we both agree that this always must be done with all four Ps. This is not a 1P argument, but I want to double back on performance is, yes, measurable and profitable for now, but immediate measurability is rarely ever proof of larger long-term contribution. And let's face it, attribution loves what is close to conversion. And growth often comes from those effects that, although some might refer to as illusory or phantom or hard to measure, and yes, dashboards undervalue them, just because they're hard to measure doesn't mean that they don't matter. And in fact, when you look at really strong performing short-term tactics, often they are most strongly performing because of those long-term decisions that have been made that essentially have predisposed them to then be more effective and thus look more efficient when they convert. So yes, performance is measurable and profitable right now, but a really good brand manager is always having to think about the business the next quarter and the next year, and perhaps maybe even the next decade for a founder in particular. So yes, performance is measurable and profitable now. And I think this is something we can agree on. But in order to have a business that lasts another 3, 5, 10 years, you need to act and spend like you're also expecting that business to act another 3, 5, or 10 years, as opposed to just for another 30 or 60-day cycle. It would be similar to living paycheck by paycheck, not a great recipe for long-term financial health. And thus we should be thinking more about the long-term to actually keep our house in order and to make certain that we are, in fact, a sound business that's acting with the future in mind.
Thank you. Matt, your rebuttal.
Yeah, where to start? I think, yeah, as I say, I mean, the arguments are really good, but the problem I think with branding always lie more in the evidence. For instance, as I said on the IPA, I think that the problem a little bit is that that is database built on advert advertisers that in essence like send these things into a review of sort of say the best of the best. By definition, these are big advertisers that have big budgets and good agencies and believe that they can sort of like showcase and win. But the problem is it's a huge selection bias there that I would say also is a bit of the problem. Like, what is the causality? When you reach a certain size and you have certain resources, you can afford to do that long-term brand building investment. And it may not be what took you there, and it may not even be so efficient. It just, that is seen as what you need to do when you've reached that level. So I think that the selection problem is really big when it comes to that study. I think so. What more would I say about the long run? Yeah, I think it is the back again that even if you believe in it, I do think that that is a troublesome argument because the, somebody now says that uh, any listed company on any stock market in the world has about a 50-50 chance of being still no listed in 10 years, because that is the sort of rate at which companies merge or liquidate. When you sort of look at how fragile these companies now have become, they simply cannot invest in things that are hopefully good in 3 years. So I think that we have to find ways of seeing much earlier what we get out of things and make that not evidence in the grand scheme of things of how things work for the most part over time, but more evidence like performance marketing, that is, this firm is getting this value out of this in 3 months, in 6 months, and in 9 months, and be able to trace that very well, which, by the way, is feasible. But I think that is maybe where the debate needs to go to resolve it.
Now we move into the discussion. Let me start with definitions because this is where many debates go wrong. Christopher, when you say primary driver of long term growth, or what does it mean in a practical terms? If you were explaining that to a CFO, how would you define it?
Yeah, so my favorite argument I would make to the CFO to establish the primary driver is if marketers simply went back and looked at any good farmer's almanac over the last 1,000 years, the advice that would be in that almanac would be the best advice I would prescribe to them, which is that if you want to raise crops to then harvest and take to market, can we not at least agree that you got to plant those seeds at some point? And planting those seeds over time in a nutrient-dense soil with the right nurturing over time allows you then to grow said crops up to then do exactly what you want to do, which is go to market. But once you've extracted those crops to go to market and you come back to your field, if you don't have another field over here, another field over here, another field over here at varying levels of development over that same period of time, you're not going to market consistently enough to make a difference. You simply don't have anything to sell for an extended period of time, in which case, I don't know if the Farmer's Almanac ever talked about VC money, but unless you have some, yeah, you're off on your own. And so primary driver being brand would be the same thing as the simple hygiene and understanding of having different crops of seeds and seedlings at various stages being tended to over time so that crops do get to grow up in a sustainable period of time so that you can continually go to market, always backfilling and increasing the odds of future demand. It doesn't mean that a plague of locusts can't come in or that you have a drought or other circumstances might interrupt all of that long-term planning, but there would not be a single almanac in any culture with agrarian success that would give you advice to the contrary. And I would bring that same ancient advice into any CFO to argue against.
Thank you, Christopher. Mats, how would you define the primary driver of growth in a business?
I think I would want to add two things from the performance side mainly. The first one is, if we want to understand how this works without opening marketing books and arguing about experiments and stuff like that, I mean, one perspective is to look at it simply as a as a market and believe that the markets are self-regulating, right? They gravitate towards, so to say, an equilibrium of more or less the optimal solution. And then we see these kind of divisions that we've seen ever since I was a kid. I mean, we didn't have the performance marketing per se, but we have the sort of all the stuff that they just stuffed in your mailbox back in the day, right? And it would flood your floor in your apartment. And it was basically like the physical awareness for all your sort of local businesses. And that's now moved to digital. And now also you have that as the sort of thing. And there, tons of money has always sort of flown into that because it delivers results. And whether we like it or not, the question is more like, what is the equilibrium point? And I think it's higher than a lot of marketers sort of want to confess. So I think that is a way of studying it. But I will give you what I think is an even more chilling perspective. Look at ad agencies. They are the prime proponents of the primacy of brand building, right? How much brand building advertising do they do?
Well, this is my love language.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're the dentist with bad teeth. I mean,
Yes.
let's look at the Omnicom takeover of IPG. What's the first thing they did is they went into all of these branded agencies and they removed the domain names and their email address. They're now omc.com, regardless of what agency you're working with. Now, what does that signal back to the client when all of a sudden they were working for Martin Agency or GSD&M or Goodby or whomever, and now all the emails say omc.com and their own brands have been put aside?
They don't care about brand identity. They have no distinctive brand assets. They don't do brand advertising. And pretty much all their investments is in personal kind of like direct selling kind of contexts, entering contests, being out in sort of prospective client meetings. And I think if you look at it in terms of sort of say that that gives an indication, it's kind of a chilling thing. I have to go out of debate character here and just put in the caveat that I believe that it is because brand is not communication built primarily. So there is branding taking place because some agencies become world famous, yeah, but not through advertising. So if we strictly debated about advertising, I do think it's an argument against the primacy of brand communication.
Yeah. I would say they become famous through a form of creative publicity, and they do become famous through a version of word of mouth and perhaps very not, well, I guess it depends agency to agency, but yes, that somehow the word gets around, but does it ever get to flooding the entire category buyer memory that is every client that could possibly prospect for them? No. So even when it is successful, it is limited in that it itself is not using the full laws and levers at its own disposal for a professional communicator in the communications profession. Not actually being a professional communicator is a pox across all of our houses in agency land. Yes. I will agree for that motion as well.
I think another thing that I would sort of stab against brand here is that it's kind of surprising that despite all of the sort of marketing science waves we're making, there is still like a definition problem because like Baiba's definitions in the beginning, it's quite clear what performance marketing is because it will deliver pre-specified things in the short run. When it comes to brand, it becomes much more diffuse what exactly it is. And I think that it's also a problem that if you look at it, I kind of saw that there are three different ways of trying to divvy up. And one is effect temporality, right? Short versus long. And simply say that we don't know beforehand, but there are effects that come in the short run, and then there are effects that we can measure in the long run. But we don't know ahead of time which is which. The second one is more like the 95-5 kind of thing. Like, who does it kind of address, right? And related to that, a little bit like the mechanism that this is, by the way, one I believe the most in is saying that the long run is asking for a piece of memory. You want to sort of be in people's heads. And the short one is, I want you to take a decision. Even if that decision is not buying, it's still like, I want you to click on this. I want you to read more on this. So it's either an ask or it's a memory thing. But I think that our real problem in this is that if you look across the literature, it's not really like that, because when it moves from, for instance, post hoc, simply saying that all of the observable long-term effects, regardless of how they did it and the intent, serves as evidence for this, then doesn't help us make ads for the long run, for instance, because we don't know. Then maybe it's like performance ads that had a long-term effect. So I think it's kind of a messy thing. And of course, that hits harder to the brand because the short-term effects that people expect out of the performance marketing are typically much more specified and exact. So that, I think, is also like one of these things that is a weakness of branding perspective.
Now we move to the fun part, our signature brandLingual move. From this point forward, Mats will now argue for the motion and Christopher will argue against it. Same rules as before. Now, no parody. Fully inhabited the other side. So Max, 5 minutes for the motion.
Wow. For me, I've on occasion sort of written on LinkedIn and stuff like that. At this point, people who don't believe that brand building is like the foundation of long-term success is almost like a flat earther, because there's just such overwhelming evidence at this point that you got to have a mix, of course, but that the sort of primary thing is that you got to build for the future. Otherwise, you will stagnate and get a lot of problems. We also see that, what I think, if we are very specific on sort of the primacy of brand communications, is that, yeah, you could kind of like get away with performance marketing for a long time because the prices were lower and the effects were higher against what you were buying. But now we see like direct to consumer reported, like, between the last about 10 years, their customer acquisition costs rose like over 200%. And basically, everything that is performance marketing is a perfect market. You make bids and you sort of pay market rates for the effects that you get. The problem with that is that the money will always go to the platforms. Brand equity, however, breaks that, because suddenly you instead shift it to the one with the strongest brand get way better results than the one that doesn't have the brand. So that is, I think, why we're moving to this sort of flip now, that everybody and his dog, as you say, wants to build a brand again, because it's simply not economically viable to invest only in performance marketing. I also think that it's another thing, like, if you increase the price that you can get your customers to pay with just 1%, it's typically like a 10% profit improvement. It's a vast leverage to get like to be able to charge a little more. No performance marketing that I've ever seen as a study has ever gotten any price elasticity as a result, but brands do. And without the brand building, you simply don't have any pricing power. You're simply always competing in the short run to make sales. But that is, sort of, say, the third dimension. And if you get like, the sort of stability in demand and price elasticity, you have a much healthier company. And I mean, the power of brand, I think, there is one story that I like quite a lot. One has done studies, for instance, on sort of what happens when it's lights out for brands. And it's even like, it takes 3 years. Ehrenberg Bass did a study on this, really good. But I think that the coolest thing was not an experiment. It was live. When the Ukraine war started, Zara closed all their stores in Ukraine. But the Ukrainians figured out that they could buy stuff from Poland because the DHL and stuff had no problem with delivering into Ukraine. And the brand recovered in a year to almost like pre-war levels. Like people, for some reason, Ukrainians loved Zara so much that without any advertising and without any stores, they would sort of go out of their way to get it through Poland. And I think that these kind of things, like, try replicating that with performance marketing. Brand takes precedence. And I think, in the long run, it's really like this also, that mental availability and physical availability is always the constraint. And just like, that you can in a startup make your very first sales by just calling people and try to get your first clients just by personal selling. And then after that, you can play some ads and skim the market and get some through performance marketing. The further up you go, the bigger you get, the more everything will level out, because your constraint will be mental availability among the people that you will try to reach as you sort of grow exponentially. So there is no way around it when you reach a certain level, that the only way to grow is to overcome that constraint on growth, which is your mental and physical availability. And the mental one is typically the hardest. And then you need to sort of focus on it. Yeah. I think also, like, some have said that a mature brand without any marketing also keeps selling, like, year after year when that is built. And that, I think, is a strong argument against performance marketing, is that they are sort of, say, the last touch that sort of gets all the credit. But in reality, they are simply there to sort of, like, lay the final hand and milking the cows. Brand is what feeds the cows. And if you don't feed, the cows will die, and then you can stand there with like really shiny and tough performance marketers, but no milk. So that concludes my intro.
Thank you, Mats. Christopher, now the floor is yours to argue against.
Yes, let's talk about that wonderful, shiny milk bucket and just how important it is. And this is going to be cathartic. I get a chance to channel some of our most stubborn client arguments. And if they're watching, no, it's not just you. But let's argue that the best case against the motion is that really it overstates the hierarchy and understates, let's call it, the context and maybe the drivers of growth that aren't just in that one promotion P. So let's pick on the word primary. Even the strongest IPA evidence does not really say brand building is the lone captain and that performance just sits quietly along the side. It says that the best outcomes come from balance. And even the famous 60-40 ratio is not a lock. And once you say performance is merely supporting, you risk turning potentially Batman into Robin or like the hero into the sidekick prematurely. And honestly, it's not really what the evidence says. I mean, the evidence says both are necessary and effectiveness falls when either side really dominates too much. I think second, particularly like long-term growth is not communications alone. Even Ehrenberg Bass is very explicit that growth depends on two levers, mental and physical availability simultaneously. And that purchase availability, yeah, it means distribution, it means findability, it means friction reduction. I mean, just it simply means making something easier to buy. And so in many categories, I mean, that can really outweigh super, super clever brand advertising. You can have as many gorillas as you want playing drums for 60 seconds to iconic tracks that you play in your head. But that alone is not going to be the primary thing that is going to follow through to the commercial outcome that is necessary. Let's face it, a mediocre brand that is absolutely pervasive and everywhere can beat these so-called devoted, beloved brands that are simply really, really hard to buy and really, really hard to get, that go and hide themselves in strange places. And so by that logic, the motion we're all arguing is incomplete at best. Brand building may be a driver, but often it is not always the primary one, primarily all of the time. Availability, pricing, product fit, channel access, may be doing way more of the heavy lifting. That physical awareness, as you've stated it, Mats, actually does that double duty and perhaps is oftentimes for so many brands the primary thing. Walk into a grocery store, in fact, 80% of the brands on the shelf do absolutely no advertising, yet they're there perpetually for as long as I've lived as an adult. Third, I think some of the classic evidence does have a measurement problem, and you've already discussed the survivor case bias in the IPA database, so I'm gonna riff on another one, which I'll probably misquote, but I think there's also an interesting read. I think you also referenced this one. Ehrenberg Bass does note limitation when a brand stops advertising. And search and social spend are often really not fully captured in any of the historical media databases. So that means that the case against performance has sometimes often been like incomplete at best in terms of a view of actual performance activity. So if the data undercounts search, if it undercounts remarketing, retail media, or any kind of like, I don't know, behind garden wall demand capture, then the conclusion that performance is just support is probably too overconfident in a lot of cases. And performance is not just this sort of trivial thing because it's in the short term. Short-term cash flow funds long-term investment. So that gets us into that loop. But yeah, performance channels can generate profitable response really fast. It can improve, call it learning velocity or just exposing all those real buyer frictions and reveal really which audiences or messages actually convert. And that gives you very usable data in fairly kind of short-term timeframes where really most of our clients are making decisions under a great deal of duress. So this tidy split between brand creates demand and performance merely catches it might be actually too neat for messy reality. And I think lastly, context really matters. Small brands, challenger brands, being constrained budget firms. I mean, you've got all sorts of different forms of weird B2B businesses that do things for narrow, teeny little unicorn audiences. I mean, they often cannot afford broad reach, not only in the short term, but maybe ever. And so for them, like tightly targeted activation is not just support, it is literally survival. It is proof of product market fit and sometimes the only route to some kind of compounding anything. I think even the best IPA commentary on small brands acknowledges that some companies really reallocate towards short-term activation because let's face it, sustained brand investment is really just difficult to carry. So in closing, the motion contains an important truth, but it risks turning it into dogma by the use of that term primary. That long-term growth usually needs brand building, yes, but calling performance merely supporting ignores balance. It underplays availability and distribution. It can misread contexts where activation perhaps is a super practical growth lever. But I think contextually, these things matter. And thus, that primary supporting statements in the motion are really the problematic words to pick on here.
Now we move to rebuttals. Mats, you have 2 to 3 minutes to respond to what you just heard.
Oh, it's hard to rebut because I think what you're saying, Chris, is more of the sort of balanced stance rather than the hard stance of like performance prevails, right? Yeah. So I think you gave good nuance there. But I think that what I would rebut, even in the sort of cases where we say like performance marketing is a really good way of sort of testing a market and sort of seeing if demand is there and trying new things, etc., is that I think that increasingly we see that markets have now become so flooded with things that people just don't respond to direct prompting of anything anymore unless you sort of have some notion of like, I've heard these before, I know what these guys are doing, it looks familiar to me, etc. There is like a ever increasing hurdle now to people even wanting to try something new. I think that we're just like being increasingly fatigued by the sort of constant bombardment of people reaching out cold. If you're in business to business, you know what I'm talking about. You get so much stuff in your email, in your social media feeds that target you. You simply don't respond to anything that you don't have like some kind of notion of who they are, what they do, if they're useful, etc. I used to sort of scorn 10 years ago when people said, oh, brand is basically reputation and fame. And I thought it was like really hazy, like you can't be that general and you can. But I think we're actually back at that point. You simply need to start thinking about it as a raw currency that even gets you sort of even gives you a shot at doing, say, a performance marketing, even in the beginning. I do think that this is something that changes the playing field because with AI and everything, we are simply so totally bombarded by direct response things that the production cost is no longer a problem, right, with AI. So it's even getting worse and worse and worse. And the only sort of real way out of that sludge is to be, say, known more positively. And that is not just brand communications, it's really like everything else you do to sort of become known and build fame. And of course, I agree with you that it is the lifeblood to, make the sale. But sometimes if I would strike out a little bit against performance marketing, I do think that it's a little bit of an unclean comparison in a way, because I think the ultimate sort of pressure test against performance marketing in this debate isn't it sales? Why are we even calling it marketing? It's not what marketing is supposed to be doing, which is to prepare people so that they understand what we're doing and can sort of see the value in our offers, that they're interested. Sales is the sort of mechanism of actually making the sale. We don't count the cash register in a supermarket as part of our marketing, but somehow we want to sort of do the online version of that into marketing. I don't get it. So I think that there is like a time to sort of start reflecting over like what the hell we're calling things, and why did marketing end up doing sales job? And in many companies, I think that the real question should be, what is sales today? Why are they not doing the performance marketing part that they are yelling for? So I think that, that would be like my final rebuttal a little bit, that some of this performance marketing to me doesn't even look like marketing anymore. It's infrastructure.
Right.
Thank you, Matt. Christopher,
Okay.
your review.
So let me paraphrase, I think, something that you're hinting at here, which is without brand, performance often gets way more expensive and far less scalable over
Yeah.
time. Yes, but that still does not prove that brand is the primary driver. It proves that the system is still very interdependent. And I guess going back to EBI, I mean, is suggesting that it's basically a case for brand-led growth. I think it is really a case for availability-led growth. Mental helps, but so does physical a whole bunch. And that purchase availability piece is really, 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 really crucial and cannot just be called secondary or supporting. And that is way broader than brand advertising alone. Those would be the two things.
Now we move to the closing reflections. Matt, you have a moment to reflect on the whole debate and share your thoughts.
I think this was a very fun experiment to take both sides. And I found this Aristotle quote that is, it's a sign of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without embracing it. It's a pretty good way to really dig into this, to argue it from both sides. So that was a really fun experience. I think final thing when I can step out of taking sides is that I believe that both sides are wrong.
Uh,
Because I think that what they don't understand is that it's really product market fit that rules the world. Like, if you look at all the sort of really like growth and success in business is always about it's like survival of the fittest, basically, and not the best, but the most fit to their environment. The ones that sort of are curious about their customers, make offers that people actually that really resolve needs, they rise above. And that is the brand builder. And I think that that is sort of very underestimated in the sort of brand communication zealots that believe that that is what every brand book is about brand advertising. We see this time and time again, like 80% or so of the impression of a brand is typically because of brand in situ, like new BMW cars everywhere. And then you just assume that BMW is a great company, even, and a great employer, even. You make all these halo inferences, and that brand lives rent free in your head. And in my demand point constellation studies, it's even more clear that the companies that have grown the most are companies that expand into new areas that are immensely useful to people. So people have a reason to remember the social capital of knowing that Netflix is like a really good thing if you want to be able to see like tons of different films and TV series at home, etc., etc. Or IKEA solves all these problems. And that is the true brand builder. And it is not primarily driven by advertising. So I think that that is a little bit like the plot twist for me here is that these sides are arguing about something that I think is a very interesting topic, but it is a secondary topic. It is more of a specialist thing that if you have the sort of luck to be in a company where you do the other stuff right upstream, well, there is actually a figure I saw that only about 11% or something of variability in advertising effects is really about allocation of budgets and how you do it. Most of it is simply like just the budget alone
Yeah.
against what you're offering. So I think that to a large extent, I think marketers just spend way too much time thinking about communications when they should be going upstream and thinking about, do our customers really want this stuff?
Yeah, no, said, and the more I listen to that and lean into some of your own content, that concept of linguistic compression, where the category entry point becomes the brand. When someone wants to Netflix and chill, it's like it's built in.
Right.
Just looking to chill, the brand come to mind automatically and potentially into the entry point at some form of scale. I mean, I think that's a good example of that. This was really fun, and it's interesting how it feels to do this because speaking from ad land here, we're often in one mode, but as we mature in our role and understand the importance of all of the P's and all of the upstream building that needs to be done in order to make anything downstream worth the squeeze, to mix my metaphors here, you you start to empathize and then appreciate that bigger picture. So in some ways, it is all performance. It just is over different time frames. And it's still a highly interdependent ecosystem of choices that are being made that whenever oversimplified just to a certain form of advertising and a certain form of messaging really just belittles and makes the conversation and the thinking around it like just very, very, very small. Performance marketing, yes, it's great at catching the fish in a very salesman-like way, as you alluded to a couple different times. It would have been interesting to run this debate and maybe for a future debate to really like find an interesting motion around the present day modern or postmodern sense of what is sales right now. But I think even then we would agree that, yeah, if it's great at catching fish, it is not putting more fish in the pond. So I think in the end, it's back to your Aristotle quote. And I think the spirit of brandLingual that Baiba and I are building is trying to keep two ideas in your head alive at the same time and be able to fluently translate between the two in the space in between. And thus just be far more flexible and empathetic with our clients as opposed to just over relying on ideology or dogma. And I think that's the thing that something like this experience really tests is your ability to find some bilingualism in the whole thing shows that you have not completely mainlined the Kool-Aid on either side. And I
Yeah,
think that's a really healthy place to be as a marketer. And we hope to do many more of these as well on similar topics.
that's really cool. I think another thing that I would want to step back, I touched on the problems with the actual definitions of what is what, and that there are at least 3 dimensions to sort of call it, like grouping these things into something that in some shape or another is brand versus performance, short versus long. I also find it interesting because I've had some discussions, for instance, with my brilliant colleague Per Öhlin, who is also a strategist, but he's worked a lot as a creative director in all the sort of disciplines of that and still does. And he kind of reminds me that, look, in reality, these things aren't black and white categories because as a creator, you can do so much, like depending on the brand and the idea, you know, communication doesn't sort of adhere to like a predisposed kind of idea of that it will do this job and only this job. Because sometimes when you break the really good ones, you actually get tremendously good effects, both short and long term. There are also some performance marketers who swear that they can do both and claim that they have the measurements to do it. I'm skeptical because I think that it really is one of these things that everybody wants to make the sort of campaigns that stick out the most, you know, the 1 in 100 concepts. And I think that that is also something we shouldn't lose in this, that great communications will bridge these kind of things. It will simply stand out so much that it makes these distinctions kind of a bit moot. But I think that the argument for thinking in these terms is that it's still rare. You cannot rely on having creators that do the kind of stuff that is like immensely superior to what the competitors are trying to do. And then I think that this is an important topic. But I would still want to sort of just add it that there is a bit of creative supercharger in these things that sometimes I think gets lost with the theoretical debates as if it doesn't matter. And I do think it does matter quite a lot.
Yeah, I've heard recently, we quoted Bennett and Fields, long and short of it, that there is some regret, I don't know, 12 years later from when it was published, of using the phrase long term around brand as opposed to long lasting. Suggesting that a really well designed piece of, and let's just call it brand communications, can sell on day one and day two, in some cases, just as well as quote unquote performance. The difference is that the decay on the performance piece is steep. It's a big spike and then it's steep and does not last. Whereas that kind of work that you were speaking to on behalf of your colleague can also then work week 2, week 3, month 4, in some cases, year
Absolutely.
5, assuming it's got the right fuel behind it in terms of rocket stages to get it off to Mars or wherever it's going. But that once you have it, it doesn't really wear out.
Yes.
That's also the other thing that colleagues in our industry, Baiba is always great to pull this out in our webinars when we do our teaching, is that the one thing our own industry doesn't want to hear is that, in fact, we can make fewer ads for fewer people with fewer messages and thus fewer hours to bill.
Yeah. One thing I would want to add also to the discussion is this is a very real subject because over the past year, I had no less than like 3 marketing heads that came with exactly the same kind of thing, that they wanted to go to brand building because their customer acquisition costs were just skyrocketing, and they were extremely heavy on performance marketing, and they saw that they need to change. They didn't have the language, but they just realized that our whole advertising machine doesn't deliver results like it used to. What am I going to do? And the funny thing is that the recipe is basically this, that, as I said, you know, this is not flat earthers. You know, we know that it is a mix. We know approximately what that mix should be. We know approximately what you need to do in the long and the short, so to say, piles of things to sort of control for this thing, that we can't rely on extraordinary breakthrough in creativity. But another thing that I said is that you need also to set up measurement so that you don't get overwhelmed and you can rest assured that your long lasting stuff will actually deliver, so that you're not betting your entire career on transitioning to something that actually then turns out to not work even after 1 year, because then you lose your job, right? So I had 3 of these. 2 of them got fired before they could sign the contract. That is how grave the situation is for a lot of CMOs. They are so, may I use the word screwed, because they have been used to going into the C-suite, showing them numbers, and people have then left them alone because those numbers are acceptable or even good, right? So they're left alone, and they learn to live like this. And then suddenly, when the customer acquisition costs double and double, suddenly the numbers are unacceptable and they need to change, and they don't even have the time to change before they get fired. That's the situation. So I think that if you are a head of marketing and you hear this, act, because you need to do this, and you need to do it before, so to say, it's too late, because the tension is there, and you need to sort of handle this in a different way to be able to show better numbers again.
It goes back to that farmer's almanac. You've come back
Yeah.
to the farm and no more seeds in the ground, and you realize, but yet someone's looking over your shoulder, tapping their watch. We need to go to market tomorrow.
Yeah.
Shall we wrap up? Thank you to Mats Georgson, Christopher Owens for taking the side switch challenge seriously. And thank you all for joining us to watch this debate. And stay tuned, there will be more of this series. We are just on our way to figure out what could be the next topic or theme for the next debate. So if you have any hot topics in your mind, please drop a comment, because we would love to hear what is on your mind. And if you have any reflection about what the 2 debaters were talking about, also feel free to share a comment. Thank you.